Okay, and welcome to this lecture on philosophical ethics. So, now when we talk about the philosophical study of ethics, there are three distinctions that we need to make here. Three things that you might call ethics. So, on the one hand, we have something which we'll call descriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics consists merely in describing what a group of people actually believe to be right or wrong without making any judgments about whether they should hold those kinds of beliefs. So you can say Americans believe in free speech. You can say Saudi Arabians believe that women ought not to be educated, and these can be true or false. Someone might argue with you and say, no, Saudi Arabians don't believe this, or maybe they do, or Americans don't believe in free speech. But you're not arguing over whether free speech is morally right or morally valuable, or whether women ought or should be educated or allowed to drive on their own, but rather you're just arguing over whether some descriptive claim is true of this culture. So at the descriptive level, this is what you would find in an anthropology class, a sociology, perhaps of some varieties, cultural sociology. So philosophers aren't usually interested in descriptive ethics, although we will see that these kinds of claims play an important role in developing arguments for other sorts of claims, so it's important to know what's going on here. Now, we would distinguish descriptive ethics from what we call normative ethics. Now, the word normative or norm or any related word there has to do with the word should or ought. So a norm just tells you the way things should be, and we have norms outside of morality. For instance, in style and other cultural norms, you'll find rules about the way things ought to be done. You ought to wear black to a funeral, for instance. That's a kind of norm about funerals. You ought to be on time for a class. That's a kind of norm of classroom behavior. You ought not to be texting during class. That's another norm of classroom behavior. You have to brush your teeth after every meal. That's a norm of hygiene. So you see that the word norm or normativity applies whenever you're making a claim about the way things should be. And so when we're talking about normative ethics, we're making specifically a claim about the way things should be ethically. So you're not merely describing this culture believes this or that culture believes this, but at the normative level you are saying free speech is good, free speech is right, women ought to be allowed to express their opinions, to learn about contrary opinions, be taught to read and write, etc. So there you're not merely describing, you're endorsing. You're saying, yes, this is the true, correct thing that should be done. So now both of these levels or areas of theorizing are distinguished from what we call metaethics, which is, as the name implies, supposed to be at a different level of analysis or theorizing than the normative level. So you can think of this, if you've had exposure in other areas, as supposed to be analogous to the distinction between physics on the one hand and metaphysics on the other hand. So, for instance, the physicists wants to know whether F equals ma is true, or whether the inverse square law accurately describes the behavior of objects around us, whereas the metaphysician wants to know whether there is a mind-independent reality such that these laws would hold even if we weren't observing the world, so that F equals ma might be a true description of some rock falling off a cliff even if human beings were never around. So physicists deal with the local phenomena, try to give you theories of how they relate. The metaphysicist then asks more fundamental questions about the very reality or nature of physics. So two, then, transposing to the ethical realm, the normative ethicist asks questions about which actions are right or wrong, and the meta-ethicist asks questions about whether anything is really right or wrong, or whether there are no real truths about morality. So let's examine this a little bit closer. So a typical kind of meta-ethical question is an epistemological question about whether there are moral truths. So is stealing wrong, for instance, or rape, is that wrong? And if so, what would make that kind of claim really wrong? That's a meta-ethical question. Now, so you have a metaphysical question about what makes these claims true. So what's the truth maker, to use a little piece of jargon there. And then you have the epistemological question. Well, how do you, if there are truths out there, how do you get to know them? And we'll talk briefly about these kinds of things. So then on the other hand, we have, one answer to what would make a moral truth true is that there might be moral facts out there. There might be, just like there's something called the fact that the cat is black, or that your name is whatever it is, that's an objective fact about the world, which you could verify somehow. Maybe there are moral facts like that, and then we'd want to know, well, what would that mean? What would the world have to be like? And we'll explore that question in some detail. So another meta-ethical question here is, what is a moral judgment? So that when you say that something is wrong, what does that mean? Is it a belief-like state? For instance, like believing that the earth is a sphere. Is it a factual kind of claim? You see how all of these things are related. If believing that rape is wrong is like believing that the earth is a sphere, then maybe there's some fact out there which corresponds to it, and my belief can track and accurately map, and maybe knowledge is somehow being connected to those facts in the right kind of way. And so you can kind of see a package view, a meta-ethical view, which we'll call moral realism in just a second. Now, on the other hand, you might say, well, no, look, moral judgment's more like emotion states, like disgust. So if I asked you how many quarts of human saliva you would like to drink, you would likely have a certain disgust reaction. And so maybe when you think about rape or you think about stealing and the wrongness of it, the response you get is more like disgust, or a feeling of dislike. That's not a belief. It doesn't track a fact about the world. So we can see two different kinds of views here, and we will be discussing them throughout this course. Now, of course, related to this is, what is the meaning of moral words? So there's, on the one hand, what kind of mental state is thinking or judging that something is right or wrong. So in the mind, what is that? Is it a belief? Is it a desire? Is it an emotion? On the other hand, you have something about language. So when you believe, so when you have a moral judgment, when you judge that something is wrong, you're likely often to say that's wrong, and you use those English words. And so then there's a separate question of, well, what's the meaning of those words? And all of these questions here are sort of rotating or gravitating around a fundamental distinction, and that's the distinction between moral realism on the one hand and what we'll just call relativism, ethical relativism, on the other hand. So moral realism is a meta-ethical theory, and it is the view that there are objective, mind-independent truths about morality. So that rape is wrong would be akin to saying the earth is a sphere. It's an objective fact about reality that you may not know, or that people may dispute, so that people in the 5th century BCE may have thought that the earth was flat, but even so they were just wrong because the earth was a sphere even back then. So a moral realist will have some, and it's a bit more tricky the further you study this to really get in there, especially once you start noticing all the philosophical moves that people make. It becomes a bit harder to say what moral realism is. But we'll start at least with the very general notion that if you think that rape is wrong objectively, without factoring in anybody's opinion or emotions, but that there's some objective thing out there which makes it the case that stealing is wrong, then you count as a moral realist. And we'll spend the next whole week talking about moral relativism, so I'll leave off talking about that for right now, because we will go spend a lot of time and revisit some of these issues. But here we're just trying to get a general feel for the difference between meta-ethics, normative ethics, etc. So moral realists will think that there are facts out there, there are truths that can be known, and then we'll talk briefly about that shortly. But there are at least two kinds of moral realism that we need to be clear about, and we will call them absolutism versus moral particularism. So absolutism is the view that moral truths are absolutes in the sense that they have no exceptions. Moral particularism, on the other hand, is the view that the moral truths are determined by particular situations. Now, these are both versions of realism, but let me flesh them out just a bit more with a particular example. So, for instance, take stealing. The moral absolutist will hold that if stealing is wrong, then it is always wrong, no matter what kind of particular situation you find yourself in. So, it's wrong if you steal a penny from a billionaire. If stealing is wrong, then that's just as wrong as stealing $1 billion from a billionaire or from stealing $100 from a person who only has $100. Stealing is wrong in its nature or because of the kind of action that it is, absolutely and without exception. And you can kind of think of an analogy here between these kinds of rules and maybe mathematical rules which admit of no exceptions, like for instance that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So there are no particular situations in which 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. There's an absolute, inviolable, universal rule which states that 2 plus 2 is 4. There's nothing any situation can do about that. So one might think. Now, on the other hand, a moral particularist will hold that it is sometimes really wrong to steal. There are cases where stealing really, really is wrong, objectively, mind independently, really. But there are also cases where stealing is right, the morally right thing to do. And it really depends on the situation. So, well, what does this mean? Well, think about, for instance, a Hurricane Katrina example. So imagine Hurricane Katrina, the real life situation. The hurricane comes through, the government doesn't respond quickly, people are there in an emergency situation on their own without supplies, and the question comes whether they should go into a local store which has been abandoned and take supplies, food, bandages, etc. Now, the absolutist will say that this is stealing and is not morally right. Whereas a particularist might say that in this particular situation, stealing is the right thing to do. It's not as though stealing is still wrong, but you could let them do it, but they will say, no, in this case, stealing is right. Taking that stuff that's not yours, which is technically stealing, is the morally right thing to do. But there are other cases where stealing would be the morally wrong thing to do, and you can fairly easily tell those kinds of cases, like where stealing from your roommate just to go out and have a drink with a friend, you take $50 from their wallet, that wouldn't be justified, but there could be cases where stealing is morally right. And we will see this kind of metaethical difference over whether moral rules are absolute or particular play out in the debate between, for instance, Aristotle, who's a moral particularist, and Kant, who will cast as our moral absolutist. So there really are these two views. Now, they're both kinds of moral realism, though, and when we talk about moral relativism, I will make sure to distinguish particularism from relativism, because there's one general line of argument which usually is taken to by the layperson to establish relativism, when really what it's aiming at is establishing particularism. So we'll discuss that in more detail in the next lecture. Now, another central question, which kind of mirrors each of these earlier questions, is how moral knowledge is achieved. So I've already mentioned some of that. Moral rationalists hold that moral truths are known by reason. And what we'll see is that you can be a moral rationalist even if you don't necessarily endorse realism of a very strict variety. But again, these questions will come up over and over again, so it's good to just have some kind of general terms, which is what we're discussing. Now, on the other hand, moral sentimentalists hold that moral judgments are more akin to emotional reactions. So, for instance, David Hume is a sentimentalist. He denies that moral knowledge, whatever it is, amounts to knowing something by reason, and asserts that it must be something more like an emotion or a desire. And so we'll contrast him with everyone else, including maybe possibly Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, Hobbes, Kant, and a bunch of others. Okay, so that's what metaethics roughly is. It's questions about the fundamental nature of morality, whether it's, you might think of metaethics as trying to answer the question, what would the world have to look like in order for stealing to really be wrong? Or, and then wondering, is it that way at all? The relativist will say no, and the realist will say yes. Now, on the other hand, normative theories already assume a verdict on this question. They assume, for instance, that there really are things which are morally right or morally wrong, and they aim to give us an account of what those things are or what their natures are. So we want to know what makes a person good or bad. And we want to know what really makes them that way, not just, relative to your ideas, beliefs, or cultures. So in some sense, it makes sense to tackle the metaethical questions first, because the metaethical questions need to be sorted out before we even go to the normative level and begin wondering, well, what would make this action right or wrong? Because you might just think there's nothing that makes it right or wrong except your cultural beliefs. So we've already answered that question. It's whatever your culture says. If your culture likes this, then that. If your culture doesn't, then that. So we want to talk about, in some sense, the issue of relativism first, and then we will look at several different kinds of normative theories, because the tentative conclusion on relativism will be that it's reasonable to think that it's false. And that's not to say that it's actually false or that we know it's false, but that the preponderance of evidence seems to suggest that it's not the right view about these kinds of things. And then we'll turn our attention to talking about various normative theories. Now, our English word ethics comes from the Greek, and this is something that I say often, but which can never be emphasized enough, and that is that the more Greek and Latin that you know, the more English makes sense to you. So the English word ethics derived from the Greek word ethos, and this word in Greek has two different meanings depending on whether it's in the singular or in the plural. So in the singular it means character, and in the plural it means custom. Now that's interesting, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that in a second, but for now let me just move on quickly, talk about the word moral. So the word moral in English comes from the Latin moralis, and also is a translation from Greek into Latin of the word ethos, so that when Latin speakers, Romans, were reading Greek texts on this, wherever they saw the word ethos, they would translate that into Latin as moralis, or mores, or derivatives thereof. And just like the Greek, it has the dual meaning of plural and singular, namely meaning character in the singular and custom in the plural. So there is no difference in English, or there ought not to be, between ethics and morals. And sometimes you find people distinguishing these terms and saying an ethical theory is one thing, a moral theory is another. And you could see why you would artificially want to make that distinction. But historically, these words are literally translations of each other. They mean the same thing. And so in this class, we will use these terms interchangeably. We will talk about ethics, morality, ethical theories, moral theories, and etc. So now there's an interesting point to this, which is more than just etymological or having to do with the meaning of the words. And that's because once you see that there are these two meanings, we're naturally led to think about two different questions. So on the one hand, we have the word being applied to persons, and of course we call persons good or bad. So you might be interested in giving a theory of what a good person is or what a bad person is. And on the other hand, we have the word applying to customs, which are certain things that people do. So those aren't persons that we're evaluating, but actions. So you might be interested in what makes an action good or what makes an action bad. Now these questions are not independent of each other, and that's because answering one will always give you an answer to the other. So for instance, if you know what a good person is, then you can define a good action as the kind of action which a good person would do. So this, for instance, is the kind of view we'll see Aristotle arguing for in the next parts of the class. So Aristotle will first of all tell us what is required to be a good person. We'll just oversimplify and say it has something to do with acquiring virtues like courage, honesty, generosity, friendliness, and etc. So a good person is one who has the virtue of courage, let's say, simplifying. And so if you want to know what a courageous action is, well, first you identify a person who possesses this virtue, and then you notice what kind of actions that person in fact performs. So you start with one and you lead to the other. And of course, that's what I just said there, that these are actions that a good person would perform. Now, of course, if you go the other way, if you want to know what a good action was, then you could define a good person. So suppose, to oversimplify again, you think that a good action is one that promotes the greatest amount of happiness in the world, and a bad action is the one that doesn't do that. So then you would say, well, a good person is one who performs actions which promote the overall happiness. So that either way you go, one answering one question, or to put it more precisely, giving a theory of one question and how the answer to it would go, automatically answers the other question. But what we're interested in here is which one is more fundamental. Where should we start? Which question do you aim at giving a theory of, and which question is defined derivatively in terms of the more fundamental theory? And what's interesting to notice historically is that this corresponds to a difference between the way the ancients, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and that group thought about what was fundamental, and namely they thought that it was the question of what makes a person good. And the modern or contemporary people have reversed that, and we see an interest in what makes an action good. Now, of course, Aristotle's type of ethics, or a Greek type of ethics, ancient ethics, is making a comeback, and it has always made a comeback at various points in history. But it is interesting to see this general overall kind of switch, and no one's really sure what brings it about. There are various theories, and I've heard everything from capitalism has something to do with it to, well, monotheism has something to do with it. And you can see plausibility in each one of these kinds of answers. But for us, it's just we're just going to note that these are two different ways of looking at ethics, and we'll try to get clear on what their relative merits are. So that's just a quick overview, introduction to the kinds of topics and questions discussed in philosophical ethics. And now let's turn to actually discussing some of them by beginning our series on relativism.